Excellent. Okay, so this is a part of our season series where I attempt to put our birding seasons in context. This is obviously autumn 2024, seasonal birding in Santa Clara County. So this is actually kind of a melding of at least three presentations I've given before, with some new material added to it and a lot of stuff taken out. So just so you know. Here we are in fall. The leaves are beautiful. They're drying up. They're falling down. The temperature's changing. Obviously, today was considerably cooler than the day before. And we're in for some cool and possibly rainy weather next week. So what does fall mean for our birds? And what does it mean for us birders? And there are actually several themes to the season, any season, in fact. And I'm talking about more than just hearty bean soup and sweet potato pie. I'm talking about first theme is moving. So this means moving to and from locations, moving to milder conditions, and moving for the purpose of finding food. And we know, for example, that the cliff swallow now, because we have modern technology and modern tracking um, techniques, that the barn swallow, which is widespread during spring and summer in the majority of North America, actually spends its winter in South America all the way down to southern Brazil and Chile and Argentina. So that's a remarkable journey, and we're only really aware of it because of these modern techniques of tracking. And it's truly marvelous when you learn about these migratory practices of the birds. So think about the barn swallow, for example, weighs only about 3/4 of an ounce. It's less than 75 cents. And that's remarkable. It makes that journey twice a year. And why does it do it? It does it because of the 23.5-degree tilt of our planet, which during the fall begins to shift, begins to angle away from the sun, meaning that we have shorter days, cooler days, and less intense sunlight. It becomes cold and ugly in the northern reaches of the northern hemisphere. And we also get shorter days, less daylight. And these changes start a bunch of other things. They beget more changes, in fact, hormonal changes in the brains and bodies of our birds. This initiates what's called Zuganrua. Zuganrua is essentially a migratory restlessness that our birds experience during the onset of a migratory season. That would be spring, or in this case, fall. So the term was coined by Johann Andreas Naumann, and you can see there he's long dead, but we remember him fondly. And in this account, it says, in accordance with their inherited calendars, birds get an urge to move. When migratory birds are held in captivity, they hop about, flutter their wings, and flit from perch to perch, just as birds of the same species are migrating in the wild. The caged birds know they should be traveling too. And this migratory restlessness, or Zuganrua, was first described by Johann Andreas Naumann, who interpreted it as to be an expression of the migratory instinct of birds. So what we're saying here is that birds have an instinct to move, and it's initiated by the cooling temperatures, the shortening days, and caused in turn by the 23.5-degree angle of our planet, which we can thank for our seasonal changes throughout the year. So here's an example. This bird held in captivity during the time of migration. I don't know what bird this is, but I have the feeling this is a European species. I can't verify that, but the birds are in flight over the laboratory where the bird is contained. He can't see the sky. He only knows where he's supposed to go, and that he's terribly, terribly late to be on the road. So take, for example, the pectoral sandpiper. During the breeding season, it's active, it's foraging insatiably, trying to find food in order to develop the eggs in the female, and in order to feed the young when they're first hatch. They have beautiful plumage. And then at some point, the plumage starts to wear down, and they become pretty fatigued with the with the activities in the north, in the breeding grounds. So in that case, pectoral sandpipers, like many other birds of the far north, move on. And I'm afraid I can't tell you what the other birds are here. There are two pectoral sandpipers, clearly, and several other stints and Asian plovers of one kind or another. But it's not uncommon for birds from the north to fly in groups with other species when they're on the move. There are a number of reasons for that, not the least of which is that they're all experiencing that Zuganrua. So looking at the map of pectoral sandpiper, it's clearly, the yellow is the breeding range of the far Arctic north, the Arctic tundra. And in fall, we have all those birds making their way south to the southern hemispheric wintering grounds. And which path you take to get to the south depends on where you begin. In the case of the pectoral sandpiper, the bulk of them are going to travel on one or two of the four migratory paths in North America. Those four migratory paths lead from the high Arctic all the way down to South America, and they are the Pacific, the Central, the Mississippi, the Atlantic. And the pectoral sandpiper selects the Central Mississippi and also portions of the Atlantic to make that journey. Very little of it is traveled on the Pacific route, but some enough are here. And let's take, for another example, American golden plover. American golden plover is another high Arctic breeder, and it tends to take the eastern route. I believe someone's got their mic on, so maybe they could turn that off. The American golden plover flies south to South America via the Atlantic flyway for the most part. The bulk of the individuals do. However, a small percentage of them fly out west, basically mirroring their journey south, but to a lesser degree. Far fewer take that route. And that is called mirror misorientation. And I speak about this frequently in all of my presentations because it's such an important concept for everybody to learn. Now, the mirror misorientation doesn't just happen with the high Arctic and the Atlantic flyway. It happens with other birds like this sharp-tailed sandpiper, which is a high Asian Arctic breeder. And its normal route would be to fly down the Western Pacific toward Australia, New Zealand, etc. But a small number of them decide to mirror their journey to the west coast of North America. And that's why we get a fair number of them, a small number of them in California. Every year or two, we have a few of them come by in the Bay Area. So you have to wonder, is this mirror misorientation, is it a mistake? Is it a frontier spirit, let's see, a creative or adventurous gene? Or is it just youthful rebellion? And I like that last explanation, even though it's tongue-in-cheek, because the majority of the birds that mirror misorient tend to be juveniles. We see that in a number of species, particularly shorebirds. So you have to wonder, why should birds migrate at all? And I think most obvious reasons is they're trying to find milder conditions. And you think about the high Arctic tundra in the winter is truly unbearable for water birds and many of our shorebirds. There's very little, if any, liquid water. There are no insects. It's hard to dig in the ground if you're probing. There's no mud. It's miserable. And the northern forests are, if they're not leafless like this, they're certainly cold and insect free. And if you're talking about seasonal wetlands, they clearly dry up by the end of summer, and by fall, the rains haven't begun, and many birds that might make this home decide to fly elsewhere where it's moist, there are lots of insects and plenty of food. So here are the rainforests in Central and South America. And here we have some local wetlands with liquid mud, plenty of vegetation, liquid water, lots of invertebrates that are reachable. So that seasonal food is so important. As I mentioned, insects are absent for the most part from the boreal forests during the winter time. It's just too darn cold. for them. So what we experience here is kind of an end of season sale for insects. There are fewer flying insects this time of year, but there's still enough to attract and to feed some of the very northern passerines that fly through our area on their way south. What many birds find in fall when they arrive here is a selection of seeds, sort of a pre-season winter sale. So we've got a lot of flowers and plants that are seeding, plenty of that food, and there's a lessening amount of flying insect food available. So we have a real change of food. We have, on the other hand, we've got fruits and berries, we've got coffee berry, and we've got a number of birds that come through our area on their way south. Cassin's vireo on the left, Bullock's oriole, Nashville warbler, western tanager. These are all birds that are leaving our area because the food that they like is going to be harder to find in fall and certainly in winter. We have in their place arriving seed eaters, grain eaters, birds that enjoy the open barren fields like the American pipit, or this herring gull on the right, which does quite fine during winter. That was greater white-fronted goose and gold-crowned sparrow on the two left-turn positions. So every bar chart we look at on a checklist tells us a story, and that story sheds light on what the bird needs and wants. And I'll show you the best sellers, and I'm going to give you some cliff notes. If any of you have read George Eliot's Middlemarch, you know it's a very difficult book to get through. I'm afraid I did refer to cliff notes when I was in college so that I could get through it. But here's a cliff note of some of the birds that I've got here on the left. Greater yellowlegs. It's found year-round here. It doesn't breed here though. It's found year-round in Santa Clara County, but many depart to breed in Canada. So you can see that decline in numbers beginning March and ending in July, where the birds return after breeding to the north. We have black-chinned sparrow, a completely different story, but still a good one. The neotropic species that breeds in Santa Clara County and winters far to our south in Mexico and Central America. So its bar chart is limited to the months that basically suggest warmer months and flowers. Red-breasted sapsucker, it's only a wintering species in our area, so we see it illuminated from mid-September to the end of February, which means this is a bird we should look out for right now. And solitary sandpiper, I know there was one seen just a couple of days ago at Lake Cunningham. This is what I call a pass-through species. It shows up briefly in spring, and it reappears after breeding in Canada in our late summer, early fall. Where it breeds is muskeg ponds in the boreal forests of Canada. So here are a few fall arrivals, familiar ones, I hope, and what they like to eat. So we've got a smattering 6 birds here. I'm hoping everybody recognizes them, but we'll talk through it. Pine siskins, of course, eat a lot of seeds, and they visit thistle feeders regularly when they're in the area. We've got fruit eaters like the cedar waxwing and the hermit thrush. Now you might balk at me calling the hermit thrush a fruit eater, but just watch how it deals with coffee berries or other berry fruiting bushes. It loves fruit, but it's also a hardy insectivore, and that also includes ruby-crowned kinglet up top and red-breasted sapsucker down below. Red-breasted sapsucker not only gets nourishment from the high sugar and high carb sap, but also from the insects that are attracted to it. We've also got aquatic birds like the canvasback eating primarily aquatic plants, and the dowitchers, both kinds, eating invertebrates. And I don't think I mentioned the yellow-rumped warbler, the upper right, but it's actually a very hardy insectivore too that occasionally visits seed feeders when there are a few insects around. So the first theme was moving, the second theme is changing. And I mean by that, changing plumage, changing diet. So let's talk first about plumage. Western tanager, beautiful colors of spring. They appear pretty worn and dull by summer's end. And you can see here an example of two different male Western tanagers. And obviously I've got the banding code in the lower left incorrect there. I apologize. So high breeding plumage on the Western tanager on the left and fall plumage on the bird on the right. We've got yellow-rumped warbler, the Audubon's male in full breeding plumage, and then the way we see it in fall. Much duller, less color, less striking. Yellow warbler, this is a female. Now, the males, of course, have red streaks on the breast. The female does not, or she has very, very few. In fall, she will lose some of her color, as will the male. And we've got a much more subdued, less intensely yellow bird in the fall. California gull, please don't freak out when you see a couple of gulls here. But in spring, they're really quite fetching. Snow white head, red orbital ring, red gape. In winter and fall, they start adopting this other plumage, this off-season plumage. Most obviously, the streaks appear on the head, the red orbital ring around the eye disappears. The bill, the color of the bill starts to sort of soften and desaturate, and that red gape is missing completely. Now, one interesting thing about Western gull is it doesn't really show much plumage. It doesn't develop streaks on the head, but it does lose a couple of things. It loses the intensity of yellow on the bill, and it also loses the yellow orbital ring around the eye. So there is a spring and a fall plumage of Western gulls, but it's a lot subtler. The lack of streaks is kind of a hallmark of the species. So let's take a look at the Western sandpiper. In early summer adults, the adult is beautiful. It's painted with bright, vivid red, beautiful scalloped pattern on the back, nice and bright, looks fresh and wonderful. Late summer, all those feathers start to kind of wear down and look a little bedraggled. And by winter, we see a very different bird that lacks color entirely. Now that late summer plumage and the winter plumage, somewhere in between there, we have the fall plumage. So a little bit of color left, but a lot of gray. Now, what happens about this time is the juveniles start to arrive. And one might think that you would have some difficulty, there'll be a little difficult to discern the juvenile from the adult, especially when you're looking at the summer adult. But remember that the summer adult is not seen with the fall juvenile. By the time that the adults arrive and the juveniles arrive, they're going to look very different. The juveniles will arrive after the adults. By the time the juveniles arrive, the adults will have achieved their winter plumage and look quite frosty by comparison, lacking all that color. So let's talk a little bit about Tayet. It's pretty well known that you need to feed babies a protein diet. So babies do not do well, baby birds do not do well on seeds and things of that sort. They really must have insects, particularly caterpillars. And here we have a savanna sparrow, which is famous for collecting insects of various kinds. It looks like they've got some mayflies here, perhaps. And another popular diet item would be caterpillars or beetles or ants and things of that sort. That's what happens in spring with a lot of our sparrows. In fall, however, they kind of move to a diet which we're more familiar with when it comes to sparrows, and that would be seeds. So white-throated sparrow on the right is photographed during fall, eating seeds. Now, the yellow-rumped warbler I mentioned before is a hardy insectivore, eating primarily insects during the spring and summer, but in fall, and definitely in winter, very lean time for insects. Yellow-rumped warblers will readily visit seed feeders or suet feeders, and they'll dine on those items. So American robin in spring is going to eat a lot of earthworms to feed to the young. In fall, it might switch to berries. And if you're looking for, if you happen to come across a bush with a lot of berries in fall or winter, just watch for robins and hermit thrushes. You'll probably be rewarded as they come to visit, and cedar waxwings too. So a third theme I want to talk about with regard to fall is recovering. Now that's recovering from the stress of breeding. It's replenishing after a long journey. And so obviously the demands of the breeding season, followed by that long journey, it really takes a toll on these birds. And birds are often exhausted and their resources exhausted during that trek. So those of you who have banded or been to a banding station know what migratory birds, what signs to look for. His orange-crowned warbler, for example, here, the purpose of the banding is to take records on the birds, their arrival, and if they've been recorded before, to make note of that, but also to examine their fat deposits. This looks to me like it could be a thrush based on the emargination I see on the primaries on the bird to the left. But I don't know exactly what species this is. But the bird on the left is showing a very vivid, very fatty yellow deposit on the belly, whereas that is completely depleted on the bird which has just arrived. The bird on the left it has been feeding for a while and it hasn't exhausted its resources yet. Perhaps it had a short flight to the banding station. The bird on the right clearly had a longer journey and it's depleted its fat resources. So now they need to recoup. Which brings me to a fourth theme, which is preparing. Regaining one's strength, lean times are ahead, and there is, of course, safety in numbers when you are regaining the strength. Birds that come to mind in fall are cedar waxwings. They gather in enormous groups in fall and winter, certainly on the valley floor. We start to see them about now. I went the entire summer without seeing any cedar waxwings at the ranch where I work. And it's not uncommon to see big groups like this. So what they're doing is they're searching for food together. There is an alarm sound that comes out when they find food. All the other cedar waxwings in the area will hear it. They'll come running. And obviously there's safety in the numbers here. It's much more difficult for a predator like a sharp-shinned hawk to take a single cedar waxwing when it's in a cloud of waxwings like this. And recently I've been doing a lot of pelagic trips, and there are gazillions of sooty shearwaters offshore right now. They have come from the southern hemisphere where they breed in New Zealand and Australia. They've come from there after they breed. So they're here during summer, which in reality is equivalent to their winter. So they spend their winter here, which is our summer. And in fall, they prepare to leave again. So these birds will leave our area soon, but in the meantime, they're foraging on the available food here that's brought in by the California current. So we have really rich waters here and a cold current from the north, which produces a lot of upwelling, making a soup of delicious food for the sooty shearwaters. And there are occasions where you can see tens of thousands of them from the beach in Santa Cruz. Sandhill cranes arrive in the Central Valley during the fall. And again, they're doing a number of things here. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. White-crowned sparrows have already started to arrive, as well as the yellow-rumped warblers. These are, famously gregarious birds, forming large flocks, sometimes mixed with other species like golden crowns or white-throated sparrows. Bush tits return to that pattern of traveling in large groups. So during the breeding season, there's a certain amount of isolation that the pairs will seek, and they'll raise their families just by themselves. In the fall, they start to rejoin the other nearby bush tits, and we have, dozens of them sometimes in feeding flocks, or in this case, bathing. A fifth theme is attracting, and I'm talking about resource-rich areas that are magnets for birds. This is where I think we should all take a little bit of note, because the fuel stops that we have here are crucial for bird survival. And if you've been on a long road trip or something, you know how urgent it is sometimes to make a rest stop and have some food and otherwise, because the next rest stop might be some distance away. But places that attract birds pretty much throughout the year, but especially during migration. Ponds with dense vegetation, because we have lots of edges here. We've got the shore, we've got the edges of the trees, and the open areas in between the trees. We've got tons of insects, etc. There's lots of earth for birds to find prey in. Deciduous groves, this one looks particularly nice because there's a mixture of old and dead trees and new trees behind. There's water, there's grass. This would be a great place to look for migrants. Mud and irrigated fields for shorebirds and plovers and pipits and horned larks, etc. Great places to look. Any place that has got abundant native plants is a good place to look for birds. And they not only provide food, but they provide protective cover. And that's really important. These birds are on the move. They're out of their familiar habitat. They don't know where all the dangers are. So the abundance of places to hide like this can't be overstated. And of course, the food, the fruit of coffee berries, the fruit of old orchards, persimmon trees are a favorite. The pistache trees, which of course are introduced, but are magnets for evening grosbeaks, finches, bluebirds, warblers. What else? Sapsuckers. Eucalyptus. Now, eucalyptus blooms in fall from November through April or May, I think. So it blooms during the time when most of the other trees are not. And these blooms attract insects, which in turn attract birds. So when you're birding, you're looking for a place to look for migrants. Search for flowering eucalyptus, because that might be a great place to find not only migrants, but birds that are overwintering, like western tanager in our neighborhood. These beautiful flowers actually produce a lot of sticky sap, which traps insects and sometimes goops up the faces of our warblers. And here's something I learned about a couple of years ago. If you recall, there was a rose-breasted grosbeak at Lake Cunningham, and it was in a eucalyptus tree eating something. And finally, somebody identified what it was eating. It was eating the red-gummed lerpsilids, which is an insect that kind of creates this crusty, fuzzy white exterior, and then glues itself to the undersides of the leaves. Now, the rose-breasted grosbeak was eating these. Looks like a pretty gross snack to me, but it seemed to be liking it. Fennel is an obvious place to look for, a productive place to look for birds, especially in migration. These tangled, sticky leaves are filled with insects and other foods, seeds as well. And particularly warblers, flycatchers, and other insectivores love this kind of patch. So watch those fennel patches. Clearly, if you know of any area where there's compost, a farm or a ranch, along the coast particularly, this is Cascade Ranch, where this famous compost pile attracted dozens and dozens of prized birds like Harris's sparrow, white-throated sparrow, clay-colored brewer's chipping. They all came here to this pile of debris because, not probably because of the fruit or the vegetation, but the insects that were attracted to it, beetles and worms, etc. Willows, clearly a good place to look. The willow flycatcher that I saw with Carter and friends on Sunday was in a patch of willows. Kai Ting was there too, so he got to see it. So yeah, check those willows for the same reason, because there are lots of insects here, and the proximity to water is also a good thing. Again, water. Any patch like this, water attracts worms, attracts insects, which attract birds. Irrigation, dripping irrigation. When we get to the really dry season, early fall before the rains have started, patches where the irrigation tubes are dripping water attract birds. They're looking for drinks. They're looking for insects. Lawns too. I like lawns later in winter for warblers. Yellow rumps, yellow-rumped warblers tend to forage on lawns because of the abundance of insects. Other warblers will join them. Townsends, sometimes orange-crowned, or overwintering warblers of various kinds, or the rarity, like a Blackburnian, might visit the ground briefly to find insects in the grass along with the other warblers. Bluebirds obviously like this too, and so do thrushes. So second to last theme, discovering. What I mean by that is here are some common and a few not so common fall birds that I think we should all be on the lookout for during fall migration, during the fall season. Merlin, they've started to arrive. I saw one a week ago. This is a male of the taiga subspecies, and here's a female. So you can see she's a little browner, and the streaking on the breast is a little bit different. And here looks like another female or perhaps an immature merlin. So this is a wonderful small falcon, not much larger than a kestrel, but it thinks it's a peregrine. So it flies with force and determination, not wafty or tern like a kestrel. This is basically a small falcon with a big attitude. And here's a big buteo with an eagle's attitude, the ferruginous hawk. I can almost guarantee that at least one will show up in Coyote Valley because these birds like farmland. They like open grassland, rolling hills, and flat areas where they can find ground squirrels and other small mammals. And they've historically shown up in Coyote Valley every year for quite some time. So watch for those in the news and then see if you can find one down in the farmland. They come in two colors. They come in the light morph and the dark morph. The dark morph ferruginous is the upper bird. The lower bird is a golden eagle. So I like this picture because it demonstrates how large the ferruginous hawk is. It's not as big as an eagle, but it's still a very large buteo. And like a lot of our kind of newsworthy hawks, it shows 3 points of light. There's a white area on the rump. There's a white area on each wing. So that generally means that it's not a red-tailed hawk. It means it could be a golden eagle, it could be a ferruginous hawk, or it could be a rough-legged hawk. So beyond the raptors and those two or three that you want to be on the lookout for right now is Willow flycatcher. There have been bunches of them so far in Santa Clara County in predictable habitat, either fennel patches or along creeks, generally in willows, as the name suggests. So there's no eye ring on this Impidinax. The tail is wide and rather square. And it, the big thing is you want to make sure you're not looking at a Pacific slope flycatcher or what's now called western flycatcher. So there's an eye ring on this bird, which is absent on the willow. That's the biggest difference, plus the more brownish coloration of the willow and the more greenish coloration of the western flycatcher. SCVBA have started to reappear. I love this bird. It likes the drier, more grassy areas, almost arid areas in our county, instead of the more creekside habitat that the black phoebe prefers. This bird has slightly longer wings, a slightly longer tail, and therefore a little bit different flight style. And if you're lucky enough to see them side by side, that will become apparent to you how different they hold themselves. I love the kind of cinnamon coloration on the belly and on the undertail. The bird on the left looks suspiciously like a vermilion flycatcher to me, and that's something to think about. Tropical kingbirds should arrive in the next month or so. We've gotten them increasing numbers the past decade. We've had, one or two, maybe even three in the county at one time, and they're usually pretty well publicized. You want to make sure you compare your bird to the western kingbird, which has a black tail and white outer tail, whereas the tropical has an olive colored tail, which is notched and longer bill and much more yellow on the breast. So keep an eye out for the tropical kingbird. And while you're at it, I'm wondering if that vermilion is going to show up again at Grant Park, or if it ever left. I kind of stopped hearing reports about it. I wonder if it's still there and if it's going to make Grant Park its permanent home. But since the first report about 12 years ago, we've had more and more vermilion flycatcher reports, and generally they have site fidelity. So they kind of keep returning to the place that they have visited, and they tend to visit them in winter, which is odd because this is a southwestern bird. You'd expect it to go farther south, but no. I want to caution you all that vermilion flycatcher females are not really conspicuous. We're looking at that one, at a female vermilion right here. And she actually looks a little bit like a Say's phoebe, I would say. I venture to say that she looks a little bit like a vermilion flycatcher, and she doesn't jump out as being different or bright red. So keep an eye out for that. Similarly, eastern phoebe could easily blend in. It likes the same sort of habitat that black phoebe does, which would be creeks and willowy patches. But if you don't see the white throat, this could look very much like a black phoebe from behind. So we've had quite a few reports of eastern phoebe over the years. They tend to arrive in fall, and some of them overwinter. So something to watch out for. So that was the passerines. The shorebirds, an interesting group, and I'm going to buzz through a bunch of these. By now, you've gotten used to the dowitchers, and it's okay if we just call them dowitchers. These are all long-billed here, I believe. But that small bird, second from the left, is a dunlin. Dunlin is kind of a uniform gray bird with very expressionless face. There's no strong supercilium. There's no bold facial pattern. It basically has kind of a vacant expression. And that drooped bill is significant and important to watch for. These tend to be late arrivals, so I haven't seen any yet. My guess is if there are any here now, they're probably very few. Here it is showing its kind of hallmark hunched style of foraging, and you can see a bunch of them here. They're very brownish. They all have that vacant expression, that all kind of medium length bill that's drooped at the tip. They tend to hang out with dowitchers, and they're a little bit smaller. These are all short-billed dowitchers here, and you could tell by that second bird from the left. If you look at the feathers just above the tail, those are the tertials. They have small golden lines inside of the feather. These are called tiger stripes, and you can see them more prominently in the bird directly behind the dunlin in the foreground. These tiger stripes on the tertials. So what I'm showing is mainly to give you a sense of the bird's size. Another bird to watch for is the ruff. This is a fairly rare bird, and it often overwinters here. It's from Asia, and it usually arrives in fall, along with the Baird sandpiper and the pectoral sandpiper, etc. So much bigger than the least sandpiper that's in the foreground, but still not a huge bird. And it has a distinctive V-shaped white area on the back, rather than two lines that meet at the tail. And here we see a stilt. We see a greater yellowlegs in the foreground, and behind it is the ruff. So give you a sense of the bird's size. Here it is again, showing a kind of a short bill, a lack of strong facial marks. Here again, those showing the bill and also those fluffed up feathers on the back. That's very typical of the ruff. And here we see a dowitcher and yellow legs, the greater yellow legs, and in the middle there's the ruff. This one shows very, very whitish face, which is typical. A lot of them have a very whitish face, which sort of accentuates that expressionless appearance. Here again, we can see the bill and the white face, etc. And it shows also very orangey legs in this case, which is also something we see a lot on ruffs. Here again, it's the bird in the middle. The bird in the back is a greater yellow legs. And I wonder if anybody knows what the bird in the front is. This is not something I've mentioned tonight. It's quite rare here. That's the stilt sandpiper. It's about the size of a lesser yellow legs. Another shorebird, which has already arrived in the county. I think it was seen at Lake Cunningham a day or two ago, along with the solitary sandpiper. This is mid-size shorebird with a fine breast pattern and a rather short bill, which tends to be yellow at the base. You can see here compared to a willet, it's not a huge bird. It has very beautiful sort of golden tones and stripes on the back. It makes it look a little bit like a snipe, at least to my eye. And here you can see it's the one looking at us right in the middle toward the back, hanging out with dowitchers again. Very, very short bill on this, always yellow at the base. Like a lot of long distance migrants, pectoral sandpiper has very long primaries. So the wing feathers, the flight feathers, the primary feathers extend beyond the tail and well beyond the tertials. So that gives it a very stretched out kind of pulled front to back appearance, which makes it stand out from some of the other birds. And here, just showing you, pectoral sandpiper does like to walk around in the grass and in the vegetation, which is confusing because so does the snipe. And the snipe and the pectoral sandpiper both have really conspicuous stripes on the back. Just a beautiful bird, very golden toned, warm and rufous. Juvenile bird here. It should be pointed out that even though there's a difference in size, pectoral about twice as big as a least sandpiper, they have very similar appearance. They both have yellow legs. They both have golden brown coloration. They both have rather short bills. But there's a huge size difference. So it's best if you could see them side by side. Another bird which showed up a few days ago, solitary sandpiper. This tends to follow creeks and tends to end up in small ponds with muddy shores where it can forage. It's a tringa, so that means it's the same genus, very closely related to both of the yellow legs. But it doesn't have yellow legs, it has olive green legs. It's also very dark on the back and it has a very conspicuous eye ring. The legs are quite a bit shorter than either of the yellow legs. But you might first think it's a yellow legs when you see it because the structure of the bird is so similar. The difference is that underneath the wings, it's entirely dark, very different from a yellow legs. And the tail, the rump, is dark. For comparison, you see the lesser yellow legs here, which is the thing it's most similar to. It's got a white rump and bright white underwing coverts. So lesser yellow legs is another bird to watch out for in the fall. Sparrows, gonna buzz through these. These are pretty familiar. White-crowned sparrows. I saw my first couple of white crowns at Vasona Lake Park the other day. I think Kai Ting and Carter were both there. Golden crowns, I haven't seen one yet, but I think any day now we'll start to see golden crowned sparrows at the ranch. Lincoln sparrow, have not seen this yet, and when it arrives, they should be fairly easy to find in weedy patches along the edges of the meadow. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. White-throated sparrow, of course, will hang out with the golden crowns and white crowns. Perhaps one will visit the ranch again, maybe next month. I usually see them around my birthday. They come in two color morphs. One is bright white and black stripes. One is tan striped, like this one. A swamp sparrow. Now, these have not shown up. This is more of a winter bird, and it'll be in salt marshes and really wet, shadowy areas. Um, so portions of Vasona Lake Park might be good, but I would put it more toward the Alviso Marina and Palo Alto Baylands. Clay-colored sparrow. This will buzz through another pass-through species. It won't stay here. And we've already seen a brewer's sparrow in the county. Clay-colored comes through about the same time. So you'll want to watch those small gray-breasted sparrows with pink bills. And if it has a lot of beautiful kind of buff and tawny coloration and a strong facial pattern, you might be looking at a clay-colored. Vesper. This tends to be a winter bird, but it may also pass through, and it's going to be in weedy sections along the edges, perhaps of Palo Alto Baylands, the Palo Alto Airport, other places like that where there might be chain link fences and dried grass and rocks like this. Kinglets. There are only two kinglets to worry about. Ruby crown kinglet is very, very familiar and very common. Golden crown kinglet, much less common, much less familiar. It's going to probably hang out where there are conifers, and we tend to see them more easily in winter, but fall is when you should begin looking for them. Probably at the higher elevations, I would imagine, like Sanborn. The last theme is surprising, and I'm sure Eric recognizes this phrase. Preston, make me a martini. This is a inside story from a long time ago, where a bird showed up, and this couple were very happy to see it, and she yelled back to her husband, Preston, make me a martini, because they were traveling in a camper. So it's always, whenever I see something good, I think about Norma and Preston. And some great, fabulous warblers are showing up right now that might warrant a martini here or there. So mirror misorientation is something that we're going to talk a little bit about. So Blackpole Warbler, this is like the hallmark, typical eastern warbler, and yet you see the extension of the range up into western Alaska. So looking at the map, the majority of Blackpole warblers take the Atlantic routes, many of them going directly over the Atlantic Ocean on their way to Brazil. It's an astounding journey for such a tiny bird, flying all the way from the boreal forests of Canada. Now, as I mentioned before, some number of individuals, a small number of individuals, fly out west, mirroring their migration over California airspace. And that brings them directly to the Bay Area. Similarly, the broad-tailed hawk has a portion of its range that approaches the Canadian border above us. So that extension westward and north and westward is what makes this a good candidate for a bird to show up in our area by way of mirror misorientation. So when you look at maps, imagine a range map being sort of like the picture on the front of a Triscuit box. So look at this picture. This is a Triscuit with blueberries, honey, lemon zest, and I'm not sure what that white stuff is, but it doesn't look good. My guess is that most people are going to do something else. So when you look at a range map, remember this picture. Many birds, maybe not most, but many birds are going to do something else. Many of us would do something else besides put blueberries, lemon zest, and honey, and whatever that white stuff is, on a cracker. This is a serving suggestion. So that's what a range map is. And every range map, especially for warblers and long distance migrants, should be taken with a hint of salt, just because you can't really believe those range maps. They're misleading because we get plenty of broad-winged hawks and we get plenty of Blackpole warblers on the West Coast. But that map would have you think otherwise. So don't let the range maps lull you into believing that those eastern warblers never show up here, because birds have got wings and they use those wings to navigate through the seasons, sometimes in ways we don't foresee. we don't anticipate. So looking at a few bar charts of warblers, we see our story, the September to October, we see lots of birds showing up on our checklist for this county. Tons of warblers show up at this time according to our historical records. That's what we should all be remembering and what we should all be thinking about when we visit Vasona Lake Park or Coyote Lake or Lake Cunningham or Almaden Lake or any place along the Guadalupe River, etc. Keep an eye out and don't forget these other birds. It's important to become familiar with the local birds, very familiar, in fact, most familiar with those birds, I would say. But don't forget about the other birds because they do show up here. That little image, that little black and white dotted line image in the upper left is just a suggestion. If you want to take a screen capture of this page, you might find it helpful in the future because it breaks down our warblers into two groups, wing bars and no wing bars. And then it breaks them down even farther, yellow undertail and white undertail and tail spots, etc. So that's a useful graphic. I encourage you to take a screenshot of it if you'd like. And similarly, the undertail patterns, of course, crucial for identifying many of our warblers. Ignore the western and eastern titles up top because we just established that many eastern birds show up here. So keep all of these birds in mind, but realize that some tail patterns are entirely distinctive, diagnostic in fact. So this is another shot you might want to take a screen capture of. It's also available online and it would be clearer. Warblers have got certain kinds of features, eye rings, eyebrows, plain yellow face, wing bars, yellow rumps, etc. Not just yellow rump, but Virginias, Cape May, Magnolia Palm, they all have yellow rumps as well as our most famous yellow rumped warbler. And here's another one talking about behaviors that all the warblers participate in. And this is important because if you're looking at a warbler that you don't quite recognize, but you see any of these features, eye rings, wing bars, etc., or you see it spreading its tail, or you see it foraging on a tree trunk, those are behaviors, and you can sort of eliminate a lot of species when you see these birds engaging in these activities. All right, so warblers to keep in mind for the fall season: Blackpole Warbler, as I mentioned, lemony yellow, wing bars, smudgy streaks on the breasts, white undertail and tail spots. Typically visits the ground on occasion. It's a bulky warbler with a heavy bill and pretty girthy. It's a slow-moving warbler as far as warblers go. And generally, we see them looking like this with a yellowish throat, yellowish breast, streaks and wing bars. I expect we will see one of these in the county, but I don't know that we have yet. I don't recall. But it's always got this suffusion of yellow. Northern water thrush, kind of a mysterious, skulking bird of the shadows. And all the shallows. So it tends to like water. It constantly bobs its tail. Vasona Lake Park is an excellent place to look for it, right near the restrooms where it has shown up for multiple years. And the Crittenden Marsh over on Google Campus is another great place. So it loves to be near water, as I said. It loves to bob its tail. It's very distinctive and very thrush-like. It doesn't really look like any of our other warblers. For one thing, it walks. And if you see a warbler walking, it's time to really pay attention. It doesn't hop, it walks, one foot in front of the other. Palm warbler. This is actually one of the more common vagrants, eastern birds that we get here. It looks a lot like a thrush or a pipit, but it's got yellow on the undertail and a little bit of yellow on the rump. It also readily visits the ground and feeds on the ground. But this is a nondescript bird. Sometimes the yellow on the undertail is really visible, and sometimes it's a little bit yellow on the throat. But it really sort of looks like a little pipit or a thrush. It does have big white patches on the tail, so that's always something you could watch out for. Now, most of these birds I'm showing you are ones that would be widely publicized once they're discovered, but there's no reason why any of us, could not discover one of these birds and be the first to report it. You just have to keep them in mind and remember that they're possible, and just keep thinking about that Trisket and the serving suggestion. Here's one that's been banded. So the Tennessee warbler will strike you as somewhere between a yellow warbler and an orange crowned. It's very closely related to an orange crowned warbler. It's the same genus, Formivora, although I think that genus has changed now. But it has white underneath the tail. And this is very different from an orange crown, which is entirely yellow on the underside. So it's a white tail, and you can see it here a little bit too, but this lemony yellow, greenish yellow coloration and that strong supercilium and that strong eye stripe distinguish it from an orange crown if you get a good look at it, but definitely that white. Blackburnian warbler, not common, but it seems like we've had more and more reports the past few years. This is a treetop species. It will strike you a little bit like a Townsend's warbler with a slightly more orangey coloration. There are other features to look at, like these stripes of white on the back. But this looks an awful lot like a Townsend's warbler, but just keep in mind it doesn't have any green on it. It has black and pale orange, peachy coloration. Bright wing bars too. So it's a handsome bird, especially if you see it in its breeding plumage. Magnolia warbler, we've seen this at Ulystak Park in the past. It's got a really distinctive tail pattern. And like I usually point out, if you have interesting spots on your tail and you're a bird, you're going to find a way of showing it off at some point. So Magnolia warbler makes a habit of spreading its tail regularly and frequently. And look at that yellow rump. Here you can see the tail from below. It's not like any other tail, really. There it is again. Really heavy eye ring also. This is a small bird. And the male American redstart always looks like this. It doesn't really have a winter plumage. So if you see a male, there's really nothing you could mistake it with. When you see a young male or a female, it becomes a little tougher. And you just have to kind of search for the yellow on the tail. That's very unusual. And the grayish head and a little bit of perhaps peachy staining on the breast. So there are tons more, of course. I can't go into them all, but I want to talk about a few places to go to look for some of these birds and realize that I can't tell you where the birds are going to be. I can just suggest places where they have been or where they might show up. The Palo Alto Baylands, as always, it's no surprise that this has got the biggest checklist in the county because it's one of the best places to go birding. You're not going to find all of the arboreal warblers here, but you might find palm warbler here. You definitely would find some of the shorebirds here, and definitely sparrows, swamp sparrow for one. Looking in the marsh in that area, of course, some of the shorebirds we talked about, the pectoral sandpiper, the ruff, any of them could show up here in this area. You just never know what's going to be someplace. Don Edwards, I particularly like this area that we're looking at now on the left, with the combination of vegetation and mud flats. So lots of places for shorebirds like pectoral sandpipers and ruff to hide. And our golden plovers love this particular spot. Don Edwards Butterfly Garden, I can imagine a number of birds here, from any of the sparrows I mentioned to several of the warblers and flycatchers. Willow flycatcher, you stopped at this spot for several years. Sunnyvale Baylands Park, it hasn't been quite as actively birded recently as, say, Ulystak or Vasona, but it's just as good historically. Tons of birds can be found in this row of double cottonwood trees, particularly during migration. Ulystak is really one of the best places now by virtue of the variety of plants and trees and edges that exist there. It's a small place. Vasona Lake Park, obviously, such a great place. all kinds of things have and will be found here in the future. Lake Cunningham Park, not only the recent shorebirds that have shown up on that flooded field on the far side of the auto loop, but the trees around the edges are fantastic for warblers and sparrows and flycatchers. Just give this place a visit sometime. So remember to look for the following food sources: the fennel, persimmons, the pistache trees, eucalyptus, willows, compost piles with water. Because these all attract insects, they all attract invertebrates, they all attract other animals, and each of these things are magnets for migrants. So in summary, autumn is moving, changing, recovering, preparing, attracting, discovering, and surprising us every day. And it is truly the best time to go birding, I think. And no matter where you are, this is my old apartment, and I had a varied thrush in these bushes below my apartment one winter, one fall. And the resources, obviously, I made a big deal about the checklists and how each bar chart tells a story. Clearly, get a checklist, use your checklist, keep it with you, take it in the field. And look for reports on Cialia.com, particularly our South Bay birds, and you'll see birds that are exciting to the community because they tend to be reported over and over again. The Baird sandpiper, this was 2 years ago, Baird sandpiper. And a news resource I really like, birdfinder.net. This highlights just the rare birds reported on eBird. So it's not everything, but it's a really good way of finding out what's happening in a county, in a given area. The problem is it's a little hard to get to. It's birdfinder.net, but then it's a really long string of letters that comes after that. If you want to take a photograph of this QR code, it'll take you directly to the page I just showed you. The way to get it also is to add the US-CA.085 code at the end of the region equals portion of the URL. So that'll take you right to the page for Santa Clara County. San Mateo County is 081. I think San Francisco, I think, is 075. They all have numbers, every county in the nation, I believe. You can also visit the Bird Alliance websites, where we have the wonderful self-guided field trip maps and descriptions. Any of these maps will help you find out where to go. You can sort them out by season as well, which is wonderful. And I came across a wonderful book recently when I was at Sierra West giving a presentation on migration. And I didn't pick it up, and I wish I had. It's Heather Wolf's book, Find More Birds, 111 Surprising Ways to Spot Birds Wherever You Are. And I particularly like the second section, Finding Birds at Their Favorite Restaurants. And it describes some of the things that I mentioned tonight, patches of water, fresh water, patches of fennel, etc., berry trees, bushes. So if you can find it, it's worth it. Of course, you can get it from Amazon. And with that, I think I will close up and thank you for coming here and attending, even though you weren't expecting me. You were expecting someone else. And I wanted to point out that the artwork at the very beginning was Joan Moreau, one of my favorite artists, and he died only in '83. But beautiful, beautiful paintings. So I've got to thank Cornell Lab and eBird for much of the material I present to you, and of course, Santa Clara Valley Bird Alliance. We have tons of classes archived and presented live. There'll be a couple of classes coming up. There's a winter class coming up. There'll be classes on swimmers and a brand new class I hope to open up either the end of the year or beginning of the year on icterids, blackbirds, orioles, crackles, and allies. So I'll end there and take a few questions.